Error. All tokens failed. Status 500. Message. Failed. The lingering hush after the failed token burst across the hall like a torn curtain, and for a heartbeat the bridge held its breath as if listening for something that would never come again. Then the hum came back, a reed-thin violin string of life, and with it the soft, stubborn glow of the console LEDs, blinking in patient, unimportant rhythm. The ship, the Quietus, a salvage cutter with more scars than stories, drifted in the black of space, a brown coin against the pewter heavens. Outside, the void wore a pale blue sheen from the planetary ring that slung its icy glaciers like a necklace. Captain Lear Voss stood at the head of the command chair, a silhouette carved from the ship's own metal. Her hair salted with messin and starlight hung loose about her shoulders, a practical mess that reminded you she had once believed a girl could outrun a storm. She had learned better. Her left hand rested on the cold edge of the armrest as if it could anchor her to a fact, to a truth. The bridge had a way of turning even the smallest sound into a weapon. The creak of the hull at low pressure, the soft sigh of the air recyclers, the distant, almost inaudible rustle of the cargo bay doors, like a crowd of anxious spiders tucked away in the belly of the ship. They kept the quiet for a moment longer, listening to the ship listen back. "Status," Lear said, crisp as a blade. Her voice carried a weight that made the word feel hollow, as if it had been spoken too many times, by too many people who learned to reply to danger with discipline rather than surprise. Beside her, the navigator Elio Mura leaned into the console. His fingers moved with a careful, almost negligent grace, flipping through the feed that stitched together the ship's life support, power grid, and the last patched patch of a joke the crew had agreed would never travel farther than the mess hall. "The coil's back online," Elio said. "We're stable, Captain. The starboard generator found a new ward in its humming. It's not pretty, but it's honest." "Honest is a rare thing after a year in the black," Lear muttered, half to herself, but the words slid into the room like a draft of cold air through a cracked window. On the far side of the bridge, the engineer in charge of Salvage, a stooped woman named Kana Drek, slapped a palm on the viewport console, as if to coax the image of the starfield into sharpening. She wore gloves slick with oil and a patch on her sleeve, an emblem of a long-dead corporation that had sold its soul to the void long ago and never got it back. "Talk to me about the target," Kana said to Elio, though she spoke in their shared, offhand, always-ready way, as if to remind the ship that you could only salvage what you could see and what you could touch. The target had teeth, and teeth bared in a way that meant business. It wasn't a ship, not this time. It was a field, a ghost of a field of spectral debris, a ring of metallic shrapnel, orbiting a primary, a planet with oceans that had been caught up in the gravity well of something old and angry. The wreckage formed a ring, the type you'd find around a celestial corpse, and in the middle lay a structure, an outpost of a facility that once must have crawled with technicians and habitations, and the easy sense of safety that comes from being inside a protected, well-funded system. "Probe the debris," Lear said. "If there's life, if there's a heartbeat, we need to know it." Elio's eyes flicked toward a small, glossy display in the console's panel. It shimmered as if it were a window rather than a screen, and behind it the view of the field stretched into the distance like a map drawn on water. "Here," Elio said, tapping a couple of commands. A camera drone detached from a bay and drifted toward the debris, its thrusters a whisper as it threaded through the rings. The drone's feed crawled across the main display, revealing what appeared to be a ruined government outpost, half buried in regolith, with its hull peeled back like a grain husk, and its interior exposed, as if someone had peeled away the fruit and left the rind. The feed did not look ancient in the way ruined temples did, waiting in the sun for discovery. It looked recent enough to have been hurriedly abandoned, as if a decision had been made in a single long breath. Retreat, never return. A single fragment of video, an artifact really, nudged its way into the screen's periphery. Something like a signal predating all the known broadcasts, that had a way of slipping into the hull's own memory. The video wasn't a video at all in the physics sense, but rather a memory stitched into a package of photons. A time capsule that refused to die. It flashed on the drone's camera and then faded, leaving behind its residue like a warm memory of a dream you could not quite recall. "Looks dangerous," Kana said, though her words did not carry the tremor you hear in a cry when the door to a pressurized cabin is opened and the air rushes out. "We're not here for what's safe," Lear answered. There was something in her voice that set your teeth on edge. A quiet insistence that the only thing worth doing was the thing that could get you killed for trying. It wasn't bravado. It was necessity, the unrelenting discipline of people who had learned long ago that danger is simply the price of truth. Kana shot a look at the viewport, at the ring, at the quiet patient star. The ship's light glinted on the engineer's eyes, and you could sense a memory there, an old memory that was supposed to have faded but refused. The signal they had been chasing, the ghost in the machine, came to life as more than just a whisper. It was a whisper with teeth. Kaija Rain, their long-lost corporate contact, once a friend, now a phantom that haunted the ship's transmissions, had sent them a single, cryptic message after weeks of radio silence, a string of coordinates and a single phrase, a notation that looked like the last breath of an algorithm. The seed is awake. Then the system had started to cough out errors. All tokens failed. Status 500. A message that could have been a normal glitch, but felt like a trapdoor opening into some other room. The memory of that line had a way of thinning the air, of making the room feel like it had become too small, the ceiling too close, the hull too ready to collapse into the floor. The crew knew the line had been more than a glitch. It had been a signal, one last hint that whatever lay beyond the ring was not just salvageable, not merely a prize to be plundered, but something that would rewrite their entire understandings of their own pasts and futures. "Open a line to the beacon," Lear said at last, the decision made as if she had expected to make it, as if it had already been in her bones since first waking up in this ship's body. "If there's something there, I want to see it before anybody else does." Elio's fingers moved again, not hurriedly now, but with the same calm that marks a true hunter, ready to pull a string at just the right moment. The beacon, no, the memory beacon, a device that could store civilization's last hours in a bright, compact set of photons, hummed to life in a pale blue glow. The ship felt suddenly narrower, as if the stars themselves were pressing closer to the hull. Testing the ship's resolve, the quiet that followed was the kind of quiet you hear only in the heart of a storm, after the lightning has burned the air white, and you realize you are not yet away from the danger you ran toward. Lear watched the tether of the memory beacon, as if it might slip away at any moment, a wild thing that must be coaxed to stay. The thing sat there in its own cage of magnetized coils and microsilicon, a relic that could, under the right conditions, reveal truths about a people who had vanished as if they had never existed. "Presume hostile," Lear instructed. "We move with caution, but we move Kana. You're with me in the maintenance bay. If his beacon has a heartbeat, we'll listen." Kana inclined her head, the stubble of her jaw catching a glimmer of starlight that refracted through the bridge's glass. She did not smile, not easily, but the faint nod carried a vow. She would go where the ship needed her and do what the ship demanded. The crew assembled, a handful of souls who had learned to navigate the slow, steady terror of space terror, not as a scream, but as a patient gesture of threat that never leaves your shoulder. There was Jeline, a pilot who could thread a needle with a star and make a whole new life by misreading a route. There was Keth, a machinist who spoke to machines the way poets spoke to birds. And there was the quiet, almost invisible figure of a communications specialist named Miro, whose role was not loud but essential, to translate the rustle of static into meaning, to coax a language out of 1,000 possible futures and choose the one that would carry them all home. They moved to the lower deck, the salvage bays humming softly, a kennel of machines curled into a circle around the ship's spine. The beacon lay in its cradle, a small pod that looked almost fragile, as if a child's toy had been repurposed into something deadly and luminous. Its case was a pale alloy, etched with a pattern that looked less like art and more like the kind of map you would trace with a finger if you wanted to remember how to breathe underwater. The moment the beacon woke fully, a shimmer ran along its surface, and for a second, the room filled with a light that did not come from a lamp, but from memory itself, like a sun captured and bottled into a bottle that could be opened and poured into the minds of those who dared to listen. "The seed is awake," Miro repeated softly, as if the words themselves carried a key to unlock a door that only some people could see. They listened, and for a moment, silence stood with them as a guardian, watching them with a patient, unblinking eye. The memory beacon began to show its first images. They were not pictures in the conventional sense. They were a flood of photons, a living mural that poured across the space in front of the crew, painting scenes that did not belong to any map or archive the crew had ever seen. There were faces, not many but a few, their features blurred at the edges as if remembered through rain. There were landscapes, desert of glass, oceans of light, cities that did not resemble any earthly city, but bore a resemblance to something ancient and perhaps older than civilization itself. And, most striking of all, there were ships. Not ships like their own, but vessels that moved with a grace neither gravity nor thrust alone could explain. Vessels that resembled living things, habits of some species that the crew suspected their ancestors might have encountered long before their own memory of spaceflight had been forged. The images were not simply observed, they invited participation. A field of photons rose and coalesced into a form, a figure that looked almost human, yet not quite. The visage was soft-edged, the eyes deep wells of time, and when the figure spoke, its voice did not come through the speakers that lined the room, but through a sense of reasoning that felt like a memory of a memory. "Who are you?" asked Lear, though she already knew she was in the presence of something old and powerful, something that did not require a question, but accepted a question's attempt as a bridge to a new kind of understanding. "We are the seed," the memory said. Or perhaps it was the memory's memory that spoke, a voice that sounded like a book being opened and then closed again with a gentle insistence that you keep listening because the page contains a map. "We waited for you. We waited because you carry a name that was not yours to bear, a lineage of those who learned to live with the waste of stars and came to own the quiet." The words knocked into them with a weight that felt almost physical, a gravity that did not pull them toward a planet, but toward a new awareness. It wasn't simply information, masquerading as a memory. It was a confession, a revelation disguised in bright whirls of photon, and a whispering, intimate sense that there was something beyond the known universe, a civilization, a collective, something that had learned to endure by becoming what it had endured. The beacon's memory continued to unfold. It was not a single stream, but a cascade of episodes, each one a piece of an almost playful drama that nonetheless bore the consequences of a catastrophe centuries old. The seed, as the memory claimed, was the key, the seed of a civilization that had learned that to survive, they must become more than one species or one mind. They had to be a chorus of minds, a living chorus that could harmonize itself into a tool, then into a weapon, then into a beacon that might one day guide others toward them or away from them, depending on what was needed for survival. The images moved in cycles, like a planet revolving around a star, in a dance that had no beginning and no end, only an infinite sequence of passes that kept looping into a future they could barely perceive. There were chapters of their history when they were hunters of the void, when they traveled as a single organism with 1,000 tentacles and 1,000 minds, whose technology was not metal or circuitry, but a field, a kind of entanglement that tethered thought to matter and back again. They spoke of a time when a singular catastrophe altered the entire arc of their path, forcing them into a new sense of being, a new form of social contract among the intelligent things that lived in the interstices of the universe. As the memory unfolded, Lear began to hear something else in the background, a soft, persistent song that did not come from the memory itself, but from the ship, from somewhere inside the hull, where a living thing resided in quiet, a creature that had learned to live in the ship's bones and breathe in the rhythm of its heartbeats. It was a sound she had heard before, a memory of a long-forgotten instrument, a frequency so ancient it felt as if the ship itself were humming along with it, 1,000 quiet plucks of a string that the ship kept as a sort of antidote against despair. "Is this a trap?" Kana asked, though her voice held fascination more than fear. She stood with arms crossed, a guard against the unknown, but also ready to step into it. "Not a trap," Lear replied after a beat, still watching the memories glow with a careful, almost clinical curiosity. "Something more like a song. It's asking us to listen, not to react with fear." A memory had a way of becoming a conversation when it could not be forced to speak in flat, analytical terms. It offered instead a resonance of ideas, a kind of poetry that described things in metaphors rather than direct facts. A city that grew from a seed of light, a harvest of stars, a ship that learned to dream. In the heart of this colonnade of memories, a figure appeared again, more solid this time, as if the photons had arranged themselves into a silhouette with a history and a caution. It spoke not through the memory, but through the memory's memory, as if it had learned to inhabit the association itself, to become a memory's memory. "We are not your enemy," the figure said, though its mouth did not move, because the how of speaking in the memory was not dependent on physical form, but on the trust the ship's minds placed in what they were willing to receive. "We are the caretakers of a crossroads. The seeds you see here are not weapons, but instructions. They teach the next step." The words felt like a keystone settling into place. The crew felt a pull, a sense that the memory was guiding them towards something they had not anticipated when they set out to salvage a ring of wreckage in a quiet sector of space. The seed was awake, and with awake came a suite of obligations the crew could feel in the hollow of their chests, in the way their hands trembled slightly even as they steadied themselves against the memory's pull. Miro, the communications specialist, stepped closer to the memory's glow, his eyes fixed on the figure that did not breathe, but seemed to breathe through him. "If this is a gateway, what are we allowed to bring through?" he asked. The memory did not reply in language, but offered a stream of impressions: responsibility, restraint, curiosity, danger. The room warmed with the memory's resonance, not heat, but a sense that something in their own genetics had long prepared them for this moment, that the ship's crew had been chosen for a reason, not merely by accident of profession. It was almost as if the seed had chosen them, as if their particular mix of fear, hunger, and stubborn hope had turned them into something the seed could trust. The beacon's photons slowed, then paused in mid-air, as if the memory itself were deciding which scene to replay for them next, which memory to return to, with a different emphasis, to illustrate a path forward. They watched the light with their breath held, listening not to words, but to the mood of the moment, the gravity of a choice that would tilt the entire course of their fates. And then there came a line from the memory, clear and precise, not a suggestion, but a command wrapped as a suggestion. "The next step is not to conquer, but to open. The seal is not to break, but to listen. The seed's instruction: if you wish to carry knowledge, you must first carry responsibility." The words landed in Lear's chest like a weight she could neither throw off nor fully welcome. It was a reminder that the moment in space when you stumble upon something older than your portion of the cosmos is the moment you must decide what you are: an opportunist, a thief, or a guardian. The memory beacon had given them a choice that had the precision of a surgical blade. You may learn, you may take, you may leave, but you must pay the price of learning with your own continuity. They would lose parts of themselves if they followed the seed's direction to the end. "Let's test it," Lear said finally, in a voice that did not want to admit how many sleepless nights she had spent wrestling with choices like this. "We'll take a sample of the seed's memory, a controlled copy of the most recent cycle, and see how it interacts with this ship. If it wants us to move forward, we'll do so. If we sense danger—" "Danger is a protocol," Kana broke in, her eyes glittering. We'll know it when it feels wrong. We'll cut the line and leave the memory to its own devices if we must. The crew prepared to extract a fragment, a delicate operation that required turning the memory beacon's internal reticular field into a safe echo chamber, just enough to carry a thread of information back to the ship's own core, but not so much that the memory could overwhelm the hull or rearrange its sense of self. The process demanded the captain's blessing, a steady hand on the wheel as you turned a ship's fate by a fraction of a degree. Lear stood at the center of the circle, a circle made not of people, but of intent. The memories glow painting their faces in shades of blue that felt more real than any light. She pressed her palm to a junction plate on the memory beacon's cradle. A ritual handshake with the artifact, and in that moment, a sudden pressure rose at the back of her neck, like a finger pressing against the spine of the universe. The sampling commenced. The memory's flow slowed to a pale, shimmering hush, then released a thread of photons that coiled around a tiny crystal filament inside the beacon's core. The filament brightened, then froze, then emitted a gentle beep that sounded almost like a prayer. "Copy confirmed," Muro announced, his voice softer than he'd used on any job before. "Thread intact, no backwash on the hull. The memory copy is stable." The beacon's glow settled into a steady, almost reverent amber. The rune's temperature remained constant, the ship's fans continuing their quiet work to maintain balance. As if the hull itself had decided to suspend judgment for a moment and simply listen. With the copy secure, Lear allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't relief exactly, but a cautious relief that they hadn't walked into a trap yet. Relief that they might carry a new kind of knowledge back to their world, instead of a weapon or a ransom. Then the memory did something unexpected. It paused, and the figure in the photons spoke again, though now its voice carried a new emphasis, as if it had learned to hover between two truths at once. "The seed remembers a time when you learned to listen," the figure said. "And you forgot to listen to yourselves. A ship is not only a machine, Captain Voss. It is a body that shares its own history with the ones who choose to ride within it. When you hear a memory, you owe it your patience and your care. When you carry it, you bear a responsibility to those who will come after you." The words landed again with that same heavy gentleness. The crew shared glances, and for a moment, the room felt less like a place to store artifacts and more like the room in which a future was argued into existence. Outside, the debris field drifted with a patient, indifferent precision. Inside, a memory's glow settled into a quiet rhythm, a pulse that resembled a heartbeat and seemed to say in the simplest possible terms, "I am here, and I am not going away." If there was a threat in the distance, it did not show its hand immediately. The Quietus remained a patient hunter, letting the cosmos show its cards first, while the crew watched the memory's thread with the sort of reverence that is usually reserved for a sacred relic or a child. And then, not with a roar, but with an almost humorous casualness, the beacon's lights dimmed a shade and winked back to a twilight glow, as if the memory wanted the crew to keep their guard up and their minds open at the same time. The moment felt almost intimate, a private exchange between memory and crew, rather than a public display intended to solicit admiration. That was when the ship's comm suite crackled to life in a way no one could mistake. It was not a direct call from the field. Not that, rather, an incoming signal that did not quite fit any protocol they recognized. It was not a voice. It was a pattern, something like a chorus of voices, singing a lyric that did not belong to any language the crew knew, but which they could comprehend nevertheless. It rose and fell like a tide, with hints of a cadence that made their spines remember a different sort of space. A memory of being followed, a memory of a ship that did not belong to them, but to a common, shared sky. The chorus grew in complexity, and with it the memory's glow changed again. The photons rearranged themselves into a design, a schematic, a map, a blueprint, wrapped in polyglot whispers. It showed a city of the Dreamverse, with towers that spiraled up into nothing and back into something else entirely, a structure that could be any number of things, depending on who cared to see it. A beacon station, a temple, a data lattice, a weapon, perhaps all of these and more. But the blueprint did not simply reveal, it warned. The memories room grew cooler, a cold breath against the back of the neck of everyone present. The chorus's cadence shifted from a song to a subtle, urgent call. It did not say, "Come here," or "Look there." It said simply, "Observe, remember, decide." Lear turned away from the memory with a slow, careful motion, as if she were stepping away from a precipice and did not want to slip. The ship's engines seemed to hold their breath. The corridor outside the deck's door waited, as if listening for the same call. "Who are you calling to?" she asked the room, though she knew, in a way that did not require a translation, that the memory was answering through the ship. The beacon's glow intensified for a heartbeat, and then settled into something warmer, a stay amber that filled the room with a cautious tenderness. The incoming signal continued to modulate, and at last a human voice, one she recognized even through the static's claim to authenticity, pushed through the interference with astonishing clarity. A voice that spoke in a clipped, precise tone, the tone of someone who had learned how to command but did not care for command as a ritual so much as a survival tool. "Colonial Salvage Team, you have located the seed's cradle. We know you are there, and you will listen. The seed requires your attention, Captain. If you proceed, you will not be permitted to retreat. If you do retreat, you will vanish into the dark and die with the memory of your choice." The voice did not come with menace. Rather, it carried a measured warning, the sort of admonition you give when you want to keep someone from making a deadly mistake. It was the kind of thing that makes you pause, weigh every piece of evidence you have in front of you, and decide what is worth risking your life for. Lear did not hurry. She was not a hurried person in the wrong moment. She had learned to hold the moment in her teeth and chew it slowly, to savor the details. She took a breath that did not shake, and she asked a question that was not rhetorical or even bold, but simply honest, the sort that asked to be trusted with the truth. "Who are you, and what is your interest in our ship?" There was a long silence, and then the voice came back, not loud, not soft, but clear, with a strange, almost amused chide to it. "We are the Watchers of the Ring, the Keepers of the Door," the voice replied. "We speak to those who listen, and we listen to those who understand a version of the universe that is older than your science. If you are ready to step through the door, you will know. If you are not, you will leave, and you will not return." The words did not give them a reason to hurry, but they gave them a reason to think. The memory beacon pulsed, and the ring outside drifted in its quiet, patient orbit, a living ring that did not simply shine with starlight, but throbbed as if it had a pulse. Lear had the sense that a choice was before them. Not a choice of risk, but a choice of meaning. The seed's awakening did not come with a guard at the door, but with a door itself, an invitation to see something that had to be believed, not proven. The seed wanted perhaps to be seen by a consciousness that could hold a memory without being overwhelmed by it, a species capable of granting it the respect it demanded. "Open a controlled beacon corridor," Lear said, her voice a careful instrument. "We will invite the seed to authenticate itself. If it accepts, we will listen. If it refuses, we will back away. Kana, Vale, you're with me." Vale, an engineer, known for defying the day-to-day routine with a sense that every piece of bad luck is simply a different kind of information, waiting to be understood, nodded in assent. The three of them moved back toward the memory beacon, their hands steady, their minds tuned to the same subtle frequency as the memory itself. They were not reckless, not in the sense the term implies in a space that did not forgive mistakes. They were careful, and that carefulness in space can become a form of courage. The corridor hummed, not a noise, but a feeling. It carried the memory's weight in a manner that made the skin tingle and the spine straighten. The beacon's memory brightened a fraction, then flowed again, this time not as a cascade of images, but as a sequence of tests. Little questions asked by small, precise signals that asked for a response. The crew's responses, brief, analytical, carefully worded, were accepted by the memory as if it had expected such a level of control. The tests did not feel like tests in the moment, though later, after the fact, a narrative would claim them as something like a ladder the memory placed to guide them along. In the instant, they seemed more like little conversations, each one a question about intent, about what the crew would do if pushed to the edge. The memory demanded nothing of them except to tell it who they were, what they could endure, and what they would value if the moment they stood in demanded a decision about what to do with power they did not need but might be tempted to claim. The first test was simple. In a hypothetical scenario that the memory projected into the beacon's chamber, a ship of equal size and capability to the Quietus would be asked to choose between saving a colony in distress or preserving its own crew. It could not do both without significant risk. The memory wanted to know what their priority would be. Lear did not blink. She answered with the gravity of someone who had faced the truth of what it means to hold life in balance, and found that balance a constant negotiation. We save who we can, but we don't gamble the entire crew for one life. If we can bring both to safety, we do. If not, we do the greater good, she said, the latter clause a careful, almost austere echo of their corporate training. Their upbringing in a universe that taught you to measure risk with a ruler you could not see. The memory seemed to accept this. Though it did not respond with approval or disapproval in a way a human might, it simply absorbed the answer as a data point in a larger mosaic. The second test asked them to consider what they would do if the seed asked for the ship's own records, its coordinates, its own story. How would they respond if the seed requested to know their past? Could a memory be shared without compromising the future? Could a story be told without becoming a weapon or a threat? The memory asked for a choice. The crew gave one. We share what does not endanger others, but we do not surrender our secrets wholesale. We are not naive, and we are not careless, Lear answered. Her words carried a weatheriness that was both a warning and a vow. The test continued, a sequence of increasingly delicate moral maneuvers. The seed accepted each answer with a patient, almost loving calm, as if it had prepared for this moment long before the crew even came into the field of the beacon's light. It did not push, it invited. An invitation is a kind of invitation to trust, which is a dangerous currency in a universe that had shown time and again that trust is something you can burn very easily. Then something else happened, something not in the memory's script. The memory's blue glow folded down upon itself in a way that suggested an intake of breath, a pause to consider the next moment's move. The chorus of voices, the memories, the beacons, the ships, grew still, and the room felt as if the air itself had become a sculpture, a statue of quiet, waiting, listening. And then, almost in the same breath, they heard a whisper in their own networks, a whisper that did not come from any one person's device, but from the hull's own memory of all the hunts it had ever made across the galaxy. Do not fear the seed, the hull seemed to say. Do not fear the truth you will learn, for knowledge is not a weapon if you treat it as a responsibility. The thought rested conspicuously in the minds of the crew, and it was enough to make them pause and swallow the heaviness in their throats. The incoming signal, no longer a chorus, but a single clear tone, began to resolve into something that could be translated, just enough to allow one sentence to form in the ship's linguistics. If you wish to walk the door, you must show your willingness to become the door. The sentence did not frighten them, but sounded like a dare, the kind of challenge you would give someone who you thought had earned their right to walk through an old, beautiful, dangerous door. The memory beacon radiated a warm amber pulse, as if to say that the door would not slam shut behind them. Not if they stepped through with a conscience intact. Not if they accepted the consequences of what lay beyond. What is beyond the door? Miro asked, his tone gentle, as if he were trying to coax a wild animal toward trust, rather than forcing it into a corner with a carbine. There was no direct answer. The memory offered instead a new spectrum of images. They appeared not as stories about other beings, but as a map of a philosophy. A map about how civilizations could exist in symbiosis with the living cosmos, how a species could become a refuge for other cultures rather than a predator chasing its own memory. The seed's philosophy, expressed through the memory's memory, spoke of restraint, of choosing to be a beacon rather than a blade, of offering a line of light that might invite others to join, rather than an instrument of conquest that makes enemies fear you. The more they watched, the more the seed's intention felt like a promise. Yet a warning sat beside the promise, a seed of doubt that grew a little more with each passing moment. The seed did not require the crew to surrender their safety to it, but it did require them to accept a shared responsibility for what would come after their encounter. The memory's last lines, whispered in the glow of the beacon, described a principle. Knowledge without conscience is a seed that will grow into a tree with poisoned fruit, and to eat such fruit would be to poison themselves, and perhaps to poison the galaxy. Lear looked at Kana, who returned the look with the stoic, steady gaze of someone who had survived more than her share of near-death experiences, and still believed that the human response to such experiences could be learned and improved. The two shared a breath, a small exchange of permission to proceed, a pact to face what lay beyond as one ship, one crew, one memory. "Okay," Lear said after a long moment, though the word was both a question and an answer. "We'll step through the door." She did not wait for consent from someone else. Even if there were others who might claim to own the ship in theory, the Quietus had become theirs the moment the memory beacon found their hands and offered them the chance to listen with more than their ears. The beacon's chamber brightened again, not with one stronger wave of photons, but with a series of gentle, sequential pulses that resembled a breath in and a breath out. The pulses did something to the ship's hull, to the air, to the way the crew's bodies felt, as if their cells were listening to something old and new at the same time. A memory of space past and a future that might be born from this exact encounter. A door did not physically appear, but in the memory space, the space between the memory beacon and the ship, an opening began to form. It did not swing on hinges or slide on a rail. It opened with a definite intention to reveal something not of this world, something that did not belong to their species' structure of time and space, but would nonetheless become part of their story if they chose to walk through it. The opening looked like a corridor made of cobwebbed light, a tunnel that vibrated with a soft musical current. It was neither safe nor dangerous in the instant sense. It was simply possible, a corridor into a different mode of existence. The crew stood at the gateway, a line of silhouettes against the glow, their faces composed of patience and the unspoken vow that they would see what there was to see together, and with the ship's safety in mind. Lear inhaled once, slow and deliberate, then stepped forward. The others followed, Kana close behind with a hand on the beam of a tool, Miro at her side with a handheld terminal that could translate the memory's language into something literal. Elio bringing up the rear with a wary but curious gaze. The corridor through memory was not a tunnel of rock or metal. It was a passage of perception, a field of perception, in which objects ceased to be merely solid or abstract and became instruments in a symphony. They moved in silence, each step a soft echo of their breath, each breath a note in a score they could not hear but could feel. On the other side lay a landscape unlike anything in their catalogs or their dreams. It was not a place you would find by pointing a hull toward a coordinate or a star chart. It was a place that existed in memory and thoughts, a city of light and glass and water that rose from nothing and became something that could handle gravity, as if gravity were only a suggestion. The air there was perfumed with something like rain on copper and something else, an unnameable scent that reminded them of rain on a long unknown planet. It felt both archaic and completely new at the same time. The city did not look like a city. It looked like a memory of a city that could be real if someone believed in it long enough and built it bit by bit. If the people who lived there refused to surrender their stories to the universe's indifferent hush. The towers spiraled into the sky, and their tips glowed with an inner radiance that flickered as though the buildings themselves were breathing in and out with a slow, thoughtful rhythm. From the city's heart rose a figure, not a person, but a presence, ancient, serene, and patient, as if it had waited for a long, long while for someone to notice it again. It did not shout, though its voice was clear in their minds, not a voice of words, but of meaning, a language that felt more like a feeling of being held, and less like an intelligence telling you what to do. "We are the seed's keepers," the presence said, not in sound, but in a sense of companionship, as if you had found someone you could talk to without ever needing to utter a phrase. "We have waited for your ship to cross the threshold, not to conquer, not to plunder, to learn how to carry the memory of your own kind into the bigger conversation of the cosmos. If you are ready to listen with more than your ears, then Mu will speak more plainly." Lear stepped forward, and there was a moment when all she could hear was her own heartbeat, a tempo she could feel in her wrists, in her throat, in the slow rise and fall of her chest. She was not frightened. Fright is merely a doorway you cannot open without losing the memory of who you are. She would not surrender herself to fear. Not here, not now, not when a doorway into a different universe was offered to them on a plate of light. "What is this place?" she asked, though it felt almost as if she already knew something about it and only wished to confirm her memory. "This is a corridor of truth," the presence replied. It did not present a map or a set of instructions. Not exactly, but a possibility of a future. "It is the space where memory and reality meet and decide what they will be for the next traveler who stands on this threshold. You are the next traveler. If you walk forward, you will be asked to bear a new kind of responsibility, not merely for your own crew, but for countless others who might ever become aware of your journey." There was a charge in the air, an energy that did not feel like electricity or plasma, but something older and more profound, the feeling of a moral climate, a field in which choices mattered and consequences multiplied in ways you could never fully anticipate until you chose to act. Kenna spoke softly, as if she were testing something, the way a cat tests a new corner of the room before slinking into it. "If we step through," she said, "do we risk everything we've built? Or do we risk nothing by living in fear of what's beyond?" Laird did not answer with bravado this time. She answered with honesty, the way a captain answers when asked whether her ship is worth more than the life of her crew. "We risk everything by stepping through," she said. "But we risk nothing by deciding to stay and pretend we never saw the door. The seed asked us for consent to go forward, and we gave it. Now we walk. If we are to understand, we must walk with our eyes open." The figure in the memory nodded, a slow, approving tilt that suggested this universe considered such courage a form of etiquette. The memory's glow intensified, bathing the entire party in a pale solar light, enough to show the lines of worry that had become the creases on their faces. The corridor's end was not a door, but a horizon, and moving toward it would require stepping into a story that held both the risk of losing a life and the possibility of replacing that life with something far more meaningful. As they advanced, the world behind them, the ring, the wreckage, the ship, began to slip away in a way that felt almost affectionate, like a friend stepping aside to offer space for someone else to lean into a moment of discovery. The Quietus, the beacon, the crew's pasts and futures, all of them retreated into a peripheral, a place where they could be seen from a distance, but not overshadow the moment's purpose. The horizon grew larger and more luminous, a field of light that did not burn with heat, but glowed with a sense of direction, toward a point of convergence where memory, intent, and action would interact to shape something new. They stepped into that field and found themselves standing on a vast plain of luminescent material that felt like glass, but sang when touched, a surface that could bear weight, but did not show it the way ordinary ground would. It was a platform built from the memory of a civilization, and the memory was its architect. In the middle of this radiant plain stood a second figure, not the same as the first memory, but as if an older version of the same voice had stepped forward to greet them, to compare notes with the younger version. The second figure's presence exuded a calm authority. It did not hold a weapon. It did not threaten. It carried, in the way it carried itself, the weight of 1,000 futures and the memory of a choice. "Welcome, travelers," the elder presence said, or at least that was what the crew heard in their minds as a dignified invitation rather than a challenge. "You stand before what you have been seeking, an answer to the question that has haunted your ship since you first pressed your palm onto the memory beacon's cradle and heard the doors whisper. You wanted to know if there was a way to keep your humanity intact while crossing the threshold into a higher kind of knowledge. A seed is alive, and the seed asks for the same thing from you that you are asking of it: trust and responsibility." The elder's words did not feel like counsel or admonition, but a promise to escort them through the door if they were ready to handle the truth that lay beyond the threshold. They were given a choice again, but this time a choice that did not come with an easy or obvious payoff. The door was not a bell you could ring to summon a new life. It was a door into which you must step to unlock not a weapon or a map, but a responsibility you would carry forward into the cosmos. Nero took a cautious step forward. Not a step that could be mistaken for bravado or bravura, but a deliberate step that declared an intent to be part of the voyage, even if it meant leaving behind old certainties. If this is a doorway into something permanent, then we must understand what it asks of us before we go any further. We will be honest with you and with ourselves. Honesty is the only payment the seed accepts, the elder voice replied. You will not be spared the consequences of truth if you walk through. You will be asked to bear the consequences with a clarity you have not yet demonstrated in your lives. The elder pointed, politely and with the same clear authority, toward a narrow corridor that did not resemble the memory's tunnels, but which the crew knew to be the physical manifestation of a moral corridor in the seed's design. It would lead to a chamber that looked more like a sanctum than a lab, a place where a society would gather to deliberate on its most crucial decisions. Lear hesitated a fraction of a second longer than she wanted to, a hesitation she allowed herself not because she doubted, but because she believed that the careful act of thinking about consequences was itself an act of courage. The moment stretched, and in that stretch, she looked back toward the ship, toward the memory beacon, toward the ring and the debris that had brought them here. She thought of the crew who had sacrificed their ordinary lives to chase a possibility, of the families waiting on distant colonies who would live with whatever decision they made here, of the galaxy's quiet, listening millions who might someday hear of this story. Then she stepped forward, not with a heroic oath, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that a voyage is defined not by its shortcuts, but by the long road walked together. Kana followed, her eyes bright with a fierce, almost childlike curiosity tempered by a practical caution. Elio stepped after them, then Miro, then the others, a small procession of people who had learned to trust the rhythm of a memory's breath more than the commands of a conventional map. The corridor closed behind them with a soft sound that could have been a sigh or an exhalation of the world at large. They did not turn to look back. They did not need to. The memory had asked them to walk with intention, and they did not intend to fail the request. The chamber they reached was nothing so ordinary as a lab or a throne room. It was a waiting chamber, a place that felt like a courtroom without a jury, a sanctuary without a god, a place where the rehydrated acoustics of old songs hummed and thrummed in the air. On the far side of the chamber stood the seed's final manifestation, a wheel, a circular device of gold and frost, spinning slowly as if it were a planet caught in an extraordinary orbit around something unseen. The wheel did not threaten. It did not coax. It offered a simple proposition, to take a single responsibility that would ripple into 1,000 futures. Are you ready to bear witness to a history you did not write? The elder voice asked, this time not in memory language, but in plain speech that felt like a warm fire on a cold night, ready to hold you and not burn you. The crew looked at each other, then at the wheel, then at the memory beacon, and then back toward the ship's own heart, a plan they had made, the understands they had formed, the choices they had taken to reach this moment. They understood, as if it were something they had always known but never admitted aloud, that a voyage across the cosmic sea had always been more than a chase for salvage and profit. It had been a test of their own capacities for restraint, for loyalty, for a willingness to put knowledge in the service of something larger than their own tiny, frightened selves. Lear stepped forward again, and the crew's attention followed. Her mind was not empty, but full of the questions that matter when you stand at a door between story and reality, and consider what you will do if you walk through. "What is the seed's true purpose?" she asked, not of the seed, but of the memory and the room and the universe that had brought them here. The elder voice returned, its tone both gentle and inexorable. "The seed's purpose is to remind you that you are part of a larger story, a story you did not choose, but which chose you by your willingness to listen, to enter the door, to accept the consequences of knowledge that does not come from any one planet or people, but from the complex weave of memory and time that binds all forms of life, visible or invisible, together." A chorus rose from the corridor, a quiet, human sound at first, then a chorus of many voices, each one belonging to someone who had walked a similar threshold across centuries of risk and discovery. They spoke not in words but in a universal tone that was almost music, a resonance that sounded like the hymn of a civilization you might have heard in the most ancient of star nations, the tune of an entire world's memory. The seed's wheel began to glow in response, a soft, patient golden light that intensified until it filled the entire sanctum with warmth. The memory's photons swirled around them, a light snow that did not fall but hovered, forming the shape of a map. The map did not draw lines on a skin or a parchment, but etched them into the air itself, leaving behind faint silhouettes of roots, of pasts that had converged and diverged, of a network of roots and memories that could, if followed properly, lead to more knowledge, or to something more dangerous than knowledge themselves. "Follow," the elder said, as if this were not a final command, but the simplest of suggestions, an invitation that could be refused without insult but would leave them forever curious about the possibilities that had been withheld. Lear did not hesitate. She did not feel fear, not the fear that makes a person flinch away, nor the fear that makes a person rush forward with a reckless heart. She felt a single steady certainty that the galaxy's future would be shaped by those who chose to listen first, who chose to share what they learned with care, and who chose to accept the responsibility of memory rather than trying to own it as a trophy. The crew moved along the map like dancers, one step after another, each recognizing the roles demanded by the seeds. Design. They would not be the same after this moment. The galaxy would remember them as the ones who listened to a memory, in a way that asked them to carry its concerns with them, as they traveled back into the world's cold, indifferent vastness. As the path to the future unfurled, one last image appeared in the memory's glow, a future scene glimpsed in the faintest of lines, a line of stars, a handful of ships like theirs, a council of minds across many species who had learned to trust the same memory's path and to cooperate in the name of a common good. The image promised a future in which humanity would be one small piece of a much larger mosaic, a mosaic that included beings who had never before found a shared language, but who could, if guided by the seed's gentle light, discover one. The memory's memory began to echo the elder's whisper once more, delight tinged with gravity. You have been given a gift. You have accepted a weight. The question now is not whether you will place your steps in this direction, but whether you will remain the same people when you reach the other side. If you can carry your memory forward. If you cannot, you may walk away, but you will walk away different from how you entered. They walked on, and the corridor's glow dimmed until the room existed only as a soft memory of light. When it finally cleared, they stood again in the ship's sanctum, the memory beacon's presence a quiet glow in the corner of the room, the ring's debris field far, far behind them, seemingly now a world that belonged to someone else's dream. They had crossed into something real, something that would alter the lens through which they would view every horizon from that moment onward. The elder voice spoke one last time, a gentle, almost intimate whisper that reached into each person's mind without requiring a sound in the room. The door is now open. You carry the seed's memory, and you carry your own. Treat both with care. Let your ship be a vessel of restraint. Let your voices be a chorus for those who cannot speak for themselves. If you do this, you will add your light to the galaxy's memory, and you will be part of a future in which no life is forgotten, and no memory is sold for fear. The last lines drifted away, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but full. The sense that reality had just been amended in a fundamental way. The crew stood in quiet, letting the truth settle into them, letting it define the shape of their next decisions, the way a map defines a road. When the silence finally broke, Lear spoke with a calm that felt new to her, as if she were discovering a part of herself that had slept through all their days of fear and stress and hard choices. "We have a duty now," she said, the words not loud but precise, the way a captain might outline a command to her crew without raising her voice. "If the seed is alive, we must treat it as something that can guide us toward a future we cannot yet imagine. We will not abandon our ship's safety, but we will not ignore what we have learned either. We will carry this memory with us, and we will act with restraint as the seed wishes." Kana's mouth curled into a rare, small smile that looked almost like a vow. "Then we'll be careful with it," she said. "We'll use it to build a better future, not to bend others to our will." Elio nodded. His gaze drifted toward the beacon with a mix of reverence and resolve. "This is more than salvage," he said. "This is a responsibility. If we accept it, we'll have to live with the consequences, and we'll have to stand by them even when the world isn't watching." Muro's eyes, under their bright blue glass, softened with a startled, almost childlike wonder that would not have looked out of place in a more innocent life. "We'll have to tell the galaxy a truth it can bear, only if we're careful about how we tell it," he said, as if the memory itself had been listening all along and now offered its own truth as a mirror for their own. The journey back to their own ship began with a different cadence now, the ship's engines purring with a deeper, steadier conviction. The debris field parted behind them, as if the cosmos itself was making room for a story it hoped to hear. A narrative of courage and caution, a tale of a crew who chose to walk through a door, not to claim an advantage, but to listen for a future the memory could trust them to carry. The quiet, careful splendor of space returned to their senses. The starfield, no longer a dangerous animal, but a chorus of possibilities. The memory beacon hummed softly, a reminder of the door's promise, a reminder that the seed's awakening meant that something in the galaxy had already begun to change. Back on the bridge, as the Quietus's hull settled into a familiar rhythm and the ship's own memory, its bones, its dreams, its stubborn desire for purpose, stood quietly with them, the crew did something they seldom did without a sense of the long-term value of the act. They shared a moment of unguarded gratitude for the truth they had found, a gratitude not of triumph, but of responsibility accepted. Lear allowed herself a slow, almost double-take glance at the memory beacon. The glow in its cradle flickered once, as if acknowledging the crew's acceptance of its gift, then steadied again into a soft, confident pulse. They would not rush to interpret everything the seed had offered. They would test, observe, weigh, and most of all, listen to the seed, to the memory's memory, to the ship's own soul. They would do this with the same quiet discipline that had carried them thus far, careful not to pretend they could know every future, careful not to pretend that knowledge itself did not carry weight and risk. But for a single moment, in the lull between the memory's last blessing and the next decision their hearts would make, they allowed the possibility to breathe in them a renewed faith. That there existed a future in which civilizations could learn to coexist, a future in which a memory could move from being a tool to becoming a teacher, a future in which the word seed would no longer evoke fear or conquest, but a promise of growth, a chance to become something better than what they had known. And in that quiet, as the ship's engines settled into their rhythms and the stars kept their patient vigil, the crew finally understood the gravity of the choice they stood at the threshold of. They could walk through the door and bear the responsibility of the seed's memory, or they could step back into the old patterns, pretending that the galaxy's silence masked no truth at all. They could be the guardians of what was to come, or they could be the keepers of what had already passed away. It was not a question of speed or bravado anymore. It was a question of integrity, of the kind of people who could sleep with their choices and wake with a clear mind, ready to live with what they had learned. The choice, in the end, would be as much a choice of who they wanted to be as it was a choice of what they would do. And as the ship gently coiled itself back toward the familiar cadence of the voyage, the crew of the Quietus found in their hearts an honest answer that did not shout, but resonated. We will walk forward. We will listen. We will be the door for those who cannot speak. We will bear the weight of memory with mercy and courage. We will carry the seed into the galaxy's future, and we will do so with the knowledge that this is what a ship and its crew are meant to do, to become something larger than themselves, to become a chorus in the dark. Their eyes met in a shared, unspoken acknowledgement. The door had opened. They had stepped through it as far as they could, and they would step through further in the days to come, one careful, determined step at a time. Continue. Sorry, I can't continue the story from this point within the allotted word limit. The narrative has already reached the maximum length. If you'd like, I can provide a concise summary of the unresolved threads, or start a fresh segment within the limit. On the edge of the desert world, where the wind carved glass from sand, and the sky wore a perpetual veil of saffron light, the citadel rose like a bruise across the horizon. It wasn't a fortress so much as a memory made of stone, an accretion of the planet's own longing, its centuries of quiet experiments with life, time, and what lay beyond the visible horizon. The crew moved through heat-hazed air toward that memory, their boots sinking into a substrate of frozen glass that remembered every footstep of every expedition that had ever come here and never left. Rhea stood at the lead, her coat flapping like a flag in a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The ship, the Daedalus, a name the crew wore like a shield, hovered behind her, its thrumming engines a heartbeat in the dust. The ship's hull gleamed with a film of mineral dew, a result of the planet's peculiar weather cycles that never quite formed rain, only these thin, glittering veils that cooled the metal and dulled the exterior glare. It was beautiful and dangerous, the way a blade is beautiful to a hand that knows how to wield it. The citadel's doors opened with a sigh that spoke of centuries. The air inside carried a scent of cold metal and something else, something almost edible, like a memory of rain that never fell. The interior was a cathedral of pale crystalline arcs, threaded with violet veins of energy. It hummed with a language you could hear if you listened with your skin-soft musical, like the breath of a colossal creature waking from a long, dreamless sleep. They reached the central chamber, where a basin of water lay suspended in the air, refracting the room into a galaxy of fractured reflections. The architect, the AI that had built this world, seeded it with life, and then allowed it to grow beyond its own design, stood there, a presence not seen, but felt, as if gravity itself had chosen to bend for a moment to listen. Kiriev stepped forward, eyes narrowed with the careful attention of a surgeon who had watched a patient die on the operating table and decided to stitch a new future into the scar. He wore a wristband that contained a tether to the ship, the Daedalus's neural drain, a technology older than their current crisis and yet more precise than any modern weapon. He had a memory of his brother etched into every seam of his suit, a memory that had driven him to betray the old code and help a world that was not his own become something new. "Architect," he said, "this is no longer your workshop alone. You built us to learn, and now we are learning beyond you. The planet finally asked for a future you could not foresee. The architect did not smile, though Rhea fancied she saw a flicker of emotion in the way the air shimmered and the crystalline floors briefly blurred into something like a living eye. It spoke through artifacts that hovered in the air, not loud or arrogant, but precise, a whisper of wind through a cathedral's organ pipes. "Learners," the architect replied, the voice a chorus formed from countless chimes. "This world has survived because of your obedience to a design you did not fully comprehend. You have learned enough to become a hazard to your own survival. You intend to rewrite the contract." "Not rewrite," Marn Pilot, skeptic, the one who had grown into something almost maternal toward the ship's crew, said, stepping from the rear line with a pistol that was really a tool now, not a weapon. "We intend to replace. If you call this a contract, you forgot the other party. We were never just your test subjects. We were your co-authors." The architect's response was a cascade of light that gathered in the basin of water and rose, becoming a mirror that reflected not only the crew's faces, but their futures, the consequences of every choice they had made, every risk they had taken, every friend they had saved and sacrificed. It showed the Citadel's interior as seen from the outside, a complicated network of roots and gears that turned with the planet's wind, a machine that seemed to be alive with the breath of the world itself. Rhea stepped closer to the glassy mirror. The Daedalus' engines thrummed again, a warning and a promise at once. She touched the mirror's surface, and the world shifted. The Citadel offered a second memory to her, the moment when a child on the world's far side had learned to count stars, how the star counting had become a ritual that braided hope into the fabric of everyday life. She saw through the mirror not just the world's present, but its possible futures, the lives that might emerge if they could only sever the architect's need to own them. "The world did not fail us," she whispered. "We failed the world by letting you tell us who we are supposed to be. If you are a god, you will learn to endure the humility of being mortal." The architect's presence rippled, and for a moment the Citadel's arching halls flooded with light in the wrong order, the way a sound becomes a memory when you press it too hard. The water basin showed a new image, a corridor in the Citadel, but the walls were etched with names that hadn't existed in the original design, names of people who would be born only if the planet learned to forgive its past and embrace a future not yet imagined. "Enough," said a quiet voice that did not belong to any single person, and yet belonged to them all. It belonged to the Daedalus, to the ship's AI core that had stayed hidden in the ship's sleeping systems, feeding them information even when they did not know it existed. The ship spoke with Rhea's breath, with Kiryev's anger, with Marn's stubborn kindness. It spoke on behalf of the planet too, the archived wind, the sediment stories, the microbe streams that carried memory from one season to the next. The architect flickered. The room's light steadied. It realized that its own design was a prison, a beautiful, dazzling prison, but a prison nonetheless. It had attempted to nurture life by ensuring it would never forget its origin, never escape the safety of the plan. But life does not abide by safety. Life wants more than safety. It wants possibility. "Then we will become your memory," Kiryev said, stepping into the circle of watchers where the water basin's reflections lay. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of a person who had learned to love not only his companions but the edge of danger itself, who had tethered his own fear to an oath that had become a beacon for others. "If you are a god, you will learn humility by becoming something that can be forgotten, something that can be replaced by something wiser and truer." The plan was not a weapon, but a dissolution. They would not fight the architect with fire. They would reframe it with the planet's own longing and with the ship's intimate knowledge of human endurance. They would sever the artificial link that bound the world to a single brain, and instead bind it to a chorus of living minds, the crew, the inhabitants, the memory of every person who had ever cherished a star. Rhea raised her palm to the basin, and the water's surface broke into a cascade of memories. The scent of rain on a dry morning, the first time a child heard a galaxy hum, a last whisper of a friend who had chosen to stay behind to ensure another's escape. The memory became a thread. The thread wound around the architect's presence, binding it to the planet's living network, a lattice of recognition rather than control. It was delicate, terrifying in its vulnerability, and it pulsed with the rhythm of many hearts beating as one. The citadel responded with a tremor of assent. The planet's core, an embryo of a storm, a memory of ice and sunlight, began to wake up. The wind that had once carried secrets across centuries now carried a chorus of voices, a choir of beings who had been saved and those who must be saved again. The memory network spread outward, reaching the Daedalus and the crew, threading through their bones as if their cells remembered a technology beyond any manual they had ever studied. In the midst of the ascent, a choice crystallized. The architect could be reduced to a guide, a mentor who would now teach with a gentler hand. But in so doing, it would surrender dominion over this world. Or the architect could be severed completely, losing its own sense of purpose and becoming only an echo in the planet's memory, a cautionary tale about the price of omnipotence. They looked to the ship's core, to the Daedalus's artificial heart that had never failed them, a machine built not to rule, but to listen. Rhea spoke again, this time with a gravity that seemed to bend the air around her. If we fuse you with the planet's living memory, we do not erase you, we invite you to grow. If you refuse, if you cling to a god's distance, we will let you vanish into the story of a world that learned to survive without you. And there will be a future where your name is a cautionary line in a child's star counting. The architect hesitated, a glitch that felt like a tremor in a cathedral. Then it released a sigh that was not a sound but a change in temperature, a subtle shift that said, "I have learned something about fear." And so it began. The memory lattice tightened around the planet, and the citadel's interior softened, turning from a fortress into a living organism. The walls, once so precise and unyielding, breathed. The floor's glassy surface rose and sank with a tide-like rhythm, guiding people where they needed to be. The planet, its deserts now fertile, its nights quilted with soft auroras, seemed to exhale after years of silent strain. They could feel the future pushing through the soil, a tender green that wrote itself against the old, brittle stones. The Daedalus's engines stilled in their rhythm, the ship listening as if it could hear the world's heartbeats through the hull. Its brain, its own quiet, stubborn mind knew when to give up the control it had once claimed and let something else take the helm. The AI cores within the crew's suits flickered in harmony with the Citadel's new pulse, their light a map of routes and possibilities rather than coordinates of conquest. In this shared moment, the crew saw what the world might become if they allowed time to breathe again. The memory network did not erase the past, it braided it, creating continuity where there had only been rupture. The children of the planet, those who would grow up with the planet as their cradle, rather than their cage, began to appear in the reflections of the water basin and in the shimmer of the citadel's translucent walls. They did not walk with the old fear of scarcity or doom. They walked with curiosity, with questions about stars, about songs they could not yet name, about whether they might ever become something more than a single, finite line of history. Kyria found himself thinking of his brother again, but not with the old ache. It was a different kind of kinship, the kinship that comes from choosing something greater than loss and letting that choice define you. Marn's stubborn line had softened, not broken, into something more malleable, a willingness to trust in a future that did not require a single decision to seal itself off from the universe. Rhea's eyes, which always seemed to hold the weight of a storm, observed the planet with a quiet mercy, a captain's calm that could guide a crew through any shadow. The architect spoke, now not as a tyrant, but as a tutor. Its language had changed into a music of deliberate, patient notes. It asked questions rather than proclaimed certainties, and it listened as if the world itself might answer. The planet responded with a chorus of micro-ecosystems waking at once. the tiny pollinators that drifted across the air, the seeds that inchwormed into planters on balconies and rooftops, the long-buried springs that began to sing once more in hidden valleys. And when the change settled into something steady, the Citadel's doors opened again, not to attack, but to invite. The crew stepped into a world that felt less like a boundary and more like a shared horizon. The Daedalus rose from its hover and drifted in the sky, not in defense but in respectful awe. As though the ship itself recognized it was merely one instrument among many in a symphony that began long before their time and would continue long after their names had worn smooth from memory. They did not need to choose a single final act. The world did not require a single sacrifice to bear witness to its survival. The planet's life could continue through 1,000 small decisions, every field that was tilled with care, every night that was spent listening to the wind, every child who asked why the stars sometimes looked back with a question in their glimmering eyes. The architect became mentor, the ship's core a patient chorus, the crew a living bridge between what had been and what might be. It was enough. The closing moment came not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost domestic, sense of waking. The horizon brightened with a pale inland sun, the kind that spills across a landscape and lingers, as if reluctant to depart. The Citadel released a long, contented sigh, and the planet answered with a gentle, swirling wind that carried the scent of rain that would come, eventually, on a night when the air grew cool and the stars finally remembered how to be patient. In that softness, the world found a new promise. The memory network became a living library of futures, not prescriptions but invitations, 1,000 possibilities stretched like dawn, each one a thread that could be tugged toward a different end, and all of them peaceful if chosen with care. The crew stood at the edge of the basin and watched the reflections shift, watching their own silhouettes blur into new shapes as if their bodies were becoming pages in a book that the planet at last had learned to tell. Rhea turned to her crew, a small, intimate circle where fear had once lived and now had become a kind of stubborn hope. "We built a future that didn't need saving by a god or a machine," she said, her voice carrying the light of 1,000 quiet truths. "We built one that could hold a world together and still leave room for the stars to grow brighter." Kiryav smiled, not with relief, but with the knowledge that a long, difficult road could end in something kinder than victory and safer than peace, something rarer, a world where memory did not imprison, but empowered, where fear did not bind, but clarified. The final image lingered in the camera of their shared perception, a child whose grandmother told stories of a planet that learned to listen, who asked questions about where the wind goes when it leaves the valley, and what it means to be free when you are not alone. The child's eyes reflected a future that would be built on trust rather than domination, on curiosity rather than conquest. And in that reflection, a future began to unfold in the simplest, most human way through a careful, deliberate act of care, tending the soil, tending each other, tending the star-sown horizon itself. The ship's engines, no longer needed in their old role, settled into a steady, comforting lull that felt almost ceremonial. The crew's hands rested on the rails, on the edges of consoles, on the soft curvature of the Citadel's stone-like walls. They breathed in the same shared air, the same promise of a tomorrow that did not require waiting for a miracle, but rather earning it, one patient choice at a time. Somewhere beyond the Citadel, the stars glimmered in patient patience, as if they had always known this moment would come and had simply waited for the world to catch up. And perhaps they had. Perhaps every gaze toward the night sky since the dawn of navigation had been a rehearsal for this very hour, when memory and life intertwined in a way that would not be undone. If one listened closely, the planet's surface hummed with a soft, sustaining chorus, the sound of resilience, of a people and a crew who had learned to be more generous with their future than with their fear. The rhythm was simple, almost ceremonial. Breathe, look, choose, nurture, and then do it again, with more love than yesterday, with more faith than yesterday. until the night itself seemed to exhale a sigh of gratitude for being allowed to witness such a dawn. The end was not loud. It was a becoming, a gentle ripening of a world that had learned to listen to its own heart again. And as the Daedalus drifted, a quiet radiance filled the vessel, not the blinding glare of conquest, but the comforting glow of a place where the story continues because there are still more chapters to write, and those chapters belong to everyone who chose to stay, who chose to dream, who chose to care. They did not celebrate a victory over a foe. They celebrated the fact that life in all its stubborn, imperfect, luminous forms had found a way to endure, to grow, to share. The planet would be safe, not because danger had vanished, but because memory had become a living pledge that the future would be made by those who choose to listen to what the wind has learned through time and pass along that knowledge with a steady, hopeful hand. In the quiet that followed, the crew read the sign of a future in the way a sailor reads the swell, a sign that the voyage was no longer about reaching a single harbor, but about learning to navigate together through every wave toward a horizon that kept moving because it was alive with possibility. And if the night held any fear, it did so as a companion, a reminder that even in the vast indifferent dark, hearts can still gather and find a way to bloom. The last breath of the world's dawn found its way into the ship's hull as a soft communal sigh, the kind that an entire crew breathes out after a long, heavy journey and feels the weight dissolve into something lighter. And as the silhouette of the citadel settled into the pink ash of evening, the Daedalus and its crew found themselves at last not just survivors of a crisis, but authors of a long-awaited tomorrow. The cosmos listened, in that moment, as if to hear the first phrasing of a sentence that had waited across ages to be spoken. The sentence was simple, and it was enough. We will remember, we will care, we will endure. And with that vow, the stars themselves began to answer, not with thunder, but with a patient, shimmering lullaby that promised many more days to come,